June 1999. In the stillness of the late night, when the entire world had fallen asleep, an 18-year-old boy sat motionless in front of a computer screen. The room was cramped, windowless. The computer was not even his. His eyes were bloodshot after nearly 60 hours without sleep. He was not a celebrated genius, not a young entrepreneur with a grand vision. He had even dropped out of college. He was just an ordinary human being, exhausted, suffocated, and frustrated by something that seemed trivial. He wanted to listen to music, but couldn't. He wanted to find a song, but had to wait for hours, only to lose everything because of a single dropped connection. In that moment, he clicked the mouse. No explosion, no alarm, no one noticed. Yet that silent click was the beginning of a shockwave that would rattle a $40 billion music empire. 6 months later, 10 million people were using his software. 18 months later, that number had grown to 80 million. Music spread faster than any law, faster than control, faster than anything the industry had ever believed to be permanent. They responded with power, with lawsuits, hearings, raids, even by suing the very people who loved their music. And when it was all over, they raised their champagne glasses, convinced they had won completely. But there was one thing they failed to understand. That boy was never the threat. He was simply the first to touch a crack that had existed for a very long time. How could a teenager with no money and no power shake an entire empire? And why did crushing him save no one while changing music forever? This is not just a story about technology. It is a story about people, and about a belief that was wrong from the very beginning. ****. Spring, June 1999. ****. At Northeastern University in Boston, there was a dorm room so small it felt almost impossible to breathe. No windows, no natural light, only the pale bluish glow spilling from the screen of an old computer. Inside that room sat 18-year-old Shawn Fanning. He hadn't slept for nearly 50 hours. Not because of parties, not because of rebellion, but because his mind wouldn't stop racing. His eyes were bloodshot, his eyelids heavy with exhaustion. His shoulders were thin, his back slightly hunched from sitting too long at the keyboard. The computer in front of him wasn't even his, it was borrowed, like so many other things in his life at that moment. Shawn didn't look like someone about to change the world. He wasn't talkative, he wasn't good at socializing. He didn't know how to impress people. In a crowd, he was the kind of person you'd easily pass by without remembering his name. But in the silence of the late night, when the entire campus had fallen asleep, Shawn was still there, typing lines of code, deleting them, rewriting them, repeating the cycle. Time passed without him noticing. He wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't thinking about fame. He wasn't even thinking that he was doing something important. He was simply trying to solve a very human problem, a problem everyone faced, yet everyone had learned to live with. Why was it so hard just to listen to a song? Why had tech experience remained stuck? In that tiny room, there was no audience, no applause, just a tired, lonely boy in a deeply human feeling frustration, helplessness, and refusal to accept things as they were. And from that cramped space, from someone so small and ordinary, something very big was quietly beginning to take shape. ****. In the late 1990s, the internet was nothing like it is today. ****. It was slow, noisy, messy, and relentlessly draining people's patience. The MP3 format had arrived. Compression technology was finally good enough to shrink an entire song into a small file. In theory, music was ready to be shared. In reality, finding a song online felt like searching for a needle in a heap of scrap metal. If you wanted to listen to music, you had to dig through unmanaged FTP servers, anonymous folders with cryptic names, here today, gone the next morning. You joined IRC chat rooms asking strangers you'd never met, hoping someone might reply. Sometimes they sent you a link, sometimes they mocked you. Most of the time, you just waited in vain. Downloading a song was never simple. It was a gamble. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, sometimes an entire evening. The progress bar crawled forward, 1 percentage point at a time. And then Just as it reached 90%, the connection dropped. Everything vanished. You stared at the screen angry, helpless, then tried again the next day. Roommates complained. The bandwidth was being eaten up. The landline phone stopped working. The room filled with the screech of dial-up modems, shrieking like a reminder that everything was working against you. The music industry saw MP3 and thought it was a problem for the future. But for users, the problem was in the present. It wasn't a lack of music. It was the absence of an easy way to find and listen to what they loved. Shawn Fanning understood this deeply, not through reports, not through conferences, but through the lived experience of a young person sitting in front of a screen night after night. He knew the feeling of meaningless waiting, the frustration of technology that promised so much, yet left people to fend for themselves. The infrastructure for a revolution already existed. Compression was ready. Bandwidth was expanding every day. Millions of people wanted digital music. But between that desire and reality, there was still a vast gap. A gap called inconvenience. And that gap was quietly demanding that something had to change. Around the 52nd hour without sleep, Shawn Fanning's body began to rebel. His head felt unbearably heavy. His eyes burned. The lines of text on the screen blurred, then sharpened again. He stood up, took a few steps around the cramped room, then sat back down, not because he had regained any energy, but because there was no other choice. It was in that state of extreme exhaustion that something strange happened. When the body is pushed to its limit, the mind sometimes falls silent. The frustration faded, the anger disappeared. All that remained was the core question he had been avoiding for days. The problem wasn't a lack of music. Music was everywhere. It lived on friends' hard drives, on the computers of students in other dorms, scattered across the world, separated only by distance and inconvenience. What people lacked wasn't content, it was a way to find one another. Shawn stared at the screen and suddenly understood. Why build a central music vault? Why gather everything in one place? Why ask permission to listen to something millions of people already owned? If every user had music, then every user could also become part of the system. No storage warehouse, no massive servers, no central authority to control it all. A peer-to-peer network. Peer-to-peer. Each person's hard drive would become a node, each node small on its own, but together forming a vast library owned by no one and fully controlled by no one. No gate to guard, no single point to shut down. If 10 million students each had just 200 songs, the network would already contain 2 billion tracks. No storage costs, no distribution costs, no permission required from anyone. The idea wasn't loud, it didn't explode into existence. It arrived quietly like an obvious answer to a question no one had bothered to ask the right way. Shawn wasn't thinking about destroying an industry. He wasn't thinking about the law. He wasn't even thinking about consequences. In that moment, he was thinking like an ordinary user. How could things be simpler, more natural, aligned with how people actually live and share? In that small room, in the stillness of the late night, Shawn began rewriting the architecture of the entire system, not to challenge power, but to fix an inconvenience that had been ignored for far too long. He didn't know that from that moment on, every assumption the music industry had relied on for a century was about to be shaken. He only knew that, at last, everything was starting to make sense. Shawn Fanning didn't share his idea with the voice of a revolutionary. He simply let it slip out quietly in online chat rooms. Short, awkward lines of text sent to strangers he had never met. The reactions came almost instantly. Most people laughed. A few ignored him. To them, it was just another naive dream from a tech-obsessed student. But in Virginia, there was one person who didn't laugh. Sean Parker, also 18. Young, sharp, someone who always saw the world as a system that could be bent. Parker didn't hear naivete in Shawn's idea. He heard opportunity, something big enough to disrupt industries long accustomed to their own power. Parker followed Shawn's trail through mutual connections, and when he finally met him, he didn't see an arrogant genius. He saw a shy, awkward boy who spoke slowly, sometimes avoiding eye contact. A kid from Brockton, Massachusetts, raised in a working-class family with no network and no backing. Shawn coded on a borrowed computer in his uncle's office. Some nights, he slept in a storage room just to have the quiet to keep writing. Not out of asceticism, but because he had no other choice. Two opposites sat across from each other. One saw the world through lines of code. The other saw the world through power and scale. Shawn wanted things to work the way people actually use them. Parker wanted to push that idea as far as it could go. One was cautious, the other bold. One just wanted to solve a problem. The other could already see a seismic shift ahead. And then the name appeared. Napster. At first, it was just an old nickname, a joke about Shawn's curly hair from his high school days. No one thought it would last. Yet that seemingly accidental name carried the spirit of the era itself. Improvised. Rebellious. Unapologetic. In that moment, the idea was no longer just a lonely piece of code. It gained ambition. It gained momentum. It gained someone willing to drag it out of a cramped room and throw it straight into the real world. Shawn and Parker had no idea what kind of battle they were about to enter. They only knew that from that moment on, they were no longer walking alone. June 1999. Napster officially appeared on the internet. No launch event, no press release. No one stood on a stage declaring anything monumental. It was simply a piece of software, quietly downloaded from a plain link. The first people to use it weren't tech critics. They were students, Shawn's friends, people from chat rooms who had skimmed a few vague lines of description. They downloaded it out of curiosity and then found themselves staring at the screen longer than usual. The interface was rough. The servers crashed often. Everything looked like an unfinished experiment. But one thing worked instantly, with almost frightening precision. They typed in the name of a song, and a list appeared. Not advertisements, not a store, but the names of other people, other computers, other hard drives existing somewhere out there. They clicked download. And for the first time, music didn't come from a company, it came directly from a stranger. The progress bar began to move, slowly but steadily. No dropped connection, no vanishing at 90%. When the song finished, there was no bill, no payment prompt, just sound flowing into the headphones. It was a deeply human moment. Surprise, excitement, and a hint of fear. One student later recalled sitting frozen in front of the screen, heart pounding, certain that someone would knock on the door, that he had just done something wrong, but no one came. There were no immediate consequences, just the next song. So he downloaded another, then another, not out of greed, but because, for the first time, everything was that easy. Word spread faster than any advertisement. One person showed another, roommates passed it along. In dorms, Napster was shared like a common secret, something no one officially allowed, but everyone wanted to try. 6 months later, 10 million users. 18 months later, 80 million. Napster didn't explode because of marketing strategy, it exploded because of experience. Because for the first time, technology didn't ask people to change their habits, it reshaped itself to fit how people actually lived, shared, and loved music. In that moment, Napster stopped being just software. It became a feeling. The feeling that the world had just opened a new door, and no one knew how to close it. At first, no one in the music industry panicked. Napster was just a strange internet phenomenon, a student fad, something that would fade away on its own, like so many tech crazes before it. Then, the numbers appeared. In glass-walled boardrooms in Los Angeles and New York, quarterly reports were laid out on the table. Executives stared at them, then at one another, searching for another explanation. CD revenue had stalled. For the first time in 20 years of continuous growth, the line on the chart was no longer rising. In 2000, global music revenue actually declined. Not by much, but enough to silence the room. 1%, 2%, small numbers on paper, but billions of dollars in the real world. Money that had once been taken for granted was no longer guaranteed. They didn't see audiences loving music any less. Concerts were still packed. Songs were still everywhere. Demand was still there. The only thing that had disappeared was one thing: the willingness to pay in the old way. Why spend $18 on a plastic disc just to hear one song, when that song could appear on your computer in minutes free, instant, no permission required? Cracks began to form where belief had once been strongest. The belief that audiences would continue to accept being constrained, the belief that controlling distribution meant controlling behavior, the belief that technology should serve the system, not people. Inside executive offices, fear went unspoken. No one stood up and declared that things were slipping out of control, but everyone felt it. A deeply human feeling, anxiety, confusion, and disorientation. Instead of asking why audiences had changed, they asked who was responsible. Instead of examining their own model, they looked for a name to blame. And that name appeared more and more often on their lips: Napster. In that moment, the industry failed to realize that the problem wasn't the software. The problem was their own outdated beliefs. And when belief begins to crack, power's first reaction is not adaptation, it is retaliation. When fear grows large enough, power always responds in the same way: attack. By late 1999, the Recording Industry Association of America officially moved in. Thick lawsuits were filed in federal court. The major record labels stood shoulder to shoulder: Universal, Sony, Warner, EMI, names that had shaped music for decades. They called Napster an existential threat. They called users infringers. And they demanded massive damages, enough to crush any young company outright. But the moment that truly shifted, everything did not come from a courtroom. It came from the music stage. Metallica entered the fight. In April 2000, the band discovered that an unreleased demo had appeared on Napster. Drummer Lars Ulrich was furious, but instead of handling it quietly, they chose a public confrontation: loud, dramatic, and deeply symbolic. One day, Lars Ulrich showed up at Napster's headquarters carrying large cardboard boxes. Inside were hundreds of thousands of usernames: real people, students, teenagers, fans who had bought concert tickets, purchased t-shirts, and hung posters on their bedroom walls. Metallica demanded that all of them be banned. Napster complied, but the public did not. The images spread fast: a millionaire band suing its own fans, suing kids without credit cards, suing people who had loved their music long before the law had caught up with technology. Overnight, the emotional balance flipped. In the public eye, the battle was no longer about protecting artists. It became a story of power bearing down on ordinary people. Shawn Fanning, the quiet kid in a hoodie, suddenly became the opposing symbol. Not because he tried to be, but because he represented a generation that felt ignored. A generation that didn't want to be treated like criminals simply for listening to music in a new way. The record labels failed to realize that they had just lost the most important thing of all: not money, but goodwill. And when power loses empathy, it is quickly seen as the villain. In trying to defend the old order, they unintentionally created a new narrative, one where the weak were sympathized with and the strong were questioned. The legal battle continued. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict had already been delivered long ago. When Napster continued to exist despite lawsuits, the music industry chose to shift its target. If they couldn't make the software disappear, they would make people afraid enough to withdraw on their own. The attack began quietly. No sirens, no loud announcements, just envelopes appearing in mailboxes. Letters written in cold, distant legal language, but carrying a weight that made readers feel short of breath. One song, two songs. Every name on the list came with a number: tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands. Figures far beyond the imagination of a student, a working-class family, or an ordinary person who just wanted to listen to music after work. Some nights, students sat in front of their computers, deleting music folders one by one, torn between guilt and panic. Some parents read the letters and folded them away in silence, unsure how to explain any of it to their children. Some people didn't even understand what they had done wrong, yet their names were still there. Fear crept into bedrooms. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. And it was real. But what the industry failed to anticipate was that fear didn't lead to total submission. It led to questions. And from questions to resistance. On college campuses, students began talking to one another. They compared lawsuit letters, shared their stories, asked the same question: was listening to music really a crime? Was the law protecting creativity or punishing the very people who loved it? Lawsuits targeting children and the elderly began appearing in the news. The public started to re-examine the entire conflict through a different lens. No longer simply right versus wrong, but fairness. Napster gradually became more than software. It became a symbol of quiet resistance. No protests, no riots, just a refusal to return to an order that no longer felt aligned with how people lived. The industry believed it could scare people into turning back time. But they forgot that once experience changes, fear can only silence people for a moment. Inside, resistance continues to grow. When they couldn't kill Napster outright, the industry chose a different target: the users. The strategy shifted quietly. No longer just massive lawsuits aimed at a company. This time, they went straight after individuals, bedroom by bedroom, home computer by home computer, ordinary people. Letters began to arrive, cold in tone, numbers that made readers' throats tighten. A single song could mean tens of thousands of dollars in damages. A personal music library suddenly became a suspended sentence hanging overhead. Some college students opened envelopes with trembling hands. Some parents read the letters and looked at their children, not knowing what to say. Some people didn't even know what an MP3 was, yet their names were still on the list. Fear spread faster than Napster ever had. People started whispering, should we delete our music? Should we stop downloading? Should we go back to buying CDs? At night, the sound of dial-up modems still filled the air, but now it was accompanied by a very real sense of unease. But fear didn't produce the obedience they expected. It produced resistance. In dormitories, students posted protest notices. On forums, users shared their stories. On many campuses, Napster was no longer just software. It became a symbol of access, of fairness, of being treated like human beings rather than criminals. When lawsuits against children and the elderly began appearing in the news, public opinion shifted again. Deeply human questions were asked. Was listening to music really worth destroying someone's life? Was the law protecting artists or punishing their own audience? The industry believed that making people afraid would drive them back to the old order. But they misunderstood something fundamental. Once people have experienced freedom, fear alone is not enough to pull them back. At that moment, the conflict was no longer between a company and record labels. It became a confrontation between power and everyday life. And the harder they tightened their grip, the clearer it became that what they were fighting was not software, but human behavior itself. Asterisk, asterisk, February 2001. Asterisk, asterisk. After more than a year stretched thin by lawsuits, threats, and relentless pressure, Napster reached a moment no one inside the company dared to name. The final ruling had arrived. The court ordered Napster to block the exchange of copyrighted music. A countdown began. 48 hours. Inside the small headquarters in Redwood City, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The people there were very young, most barely in their 20s, sitting in front of screens through the night. Dark circles under their eyes, cold coffee, no one raised their voice. No one was sure the company would still exist in the morning. Shawn Fanning walked back and forth in silence. He was no longer the boy in the dorm room, but he had never been ready for this moment. 2 years earlier, he had only wanted to make music easier to hear. Now he was watching millions of people depend on something he had created. The engineers worked almost without sleep. They tried to build audio identification filters, tried to distinguish which songs were forbidden, tried to save whatever could still be saved. But the technology of the time wasn't mature enough. File names were changed. Metadata was stripped away. The system was constantly bypassed. Meanwhile, outside those walls, 57 million users didn't wait. They sensed the end approaching, and they reacted with a very human instinct. Download everything possible. As if gathering memories before the door slammed shut. In the midst of desperation, Napster made a final offer. An unprecedented offer for a company with almost no revenue. $1 billion paid over many years to be allowed to continue as a legal service. To share profits. to find a common path forward. It wasn't just money, it was an acknowledgement that the old system needed to change, that both sides could coexist. But the answer came quickly. No. Behind closed boardroom doors, the record labels had decided they didn't want Napster to live under any form. They didn't want compromise. They wanted absolute victory. A warning lesson for anyone who might dare to try again. The $1 billion offer was rejected in less than 3 days. And in that moment, Napster's fate was sealed. 48 hours passed. No time left. No way back. Only one cold truth remained. This war would not end with an agreement. It would end with silence. July 2001. Napster officially shut down. No explosion, no chaos, just an ordinary evening when millions of people around the world opened the familiar software and received only one thing: a single error message, short, cold, without explanation. Inside Napster's offices, the atmosphere was heavy beyond words. Young employees sat silently in front of darkened screens. Some rested their heads on their desks. Others stood up, took a few steps, then stopped unsure where to go next. Months of sleepless work, unfinished dreams, ending in silence. Shawn Fanning watched it all unfold, just 20 years old. 2 years earlier, he had been a tired student in a dorm room. Now he was witnessing his own creation being unplugged in front of him. No farewell, no chance to fix things. At the same time, far away, champagne corks were popping. In polished boardrooms, handshakes were exchanged. Lawyers collected bonuses. Internal memos went out with a clear message. The battle was over. Order had been restored. The threat had been eliminated. They believed they had won. Napster was dead. The company went bankrupt. The brand was sold off for only a fraction of what it had once represented as a source of fear. A clean ending, exactly the way power was used to operating. But something didn't add up. Music didn't go back to the way it was. Human behavior didn't reverse. Hard drives were still full of songs. Connections still existed. Napster was gone, but the feeling it created was not. And in the moment the champagne was raised, very few realized that this victory existed only on paper. A perfect win in the courtroom. But out there, the world had quietly moved into a different phase. Napster fell silent. But what it awakened never went back to sleep. Napster had barely fallen silent when the very thing the industry feared most happened. Not a vacuum, but an explosion. Within days, weeks at most, users who were initially confused quickly found new paths. They asked one another on forums. They spread the word through dormitories. No advertising, no official instructions. Human instinct found its own way. Kazaa appeared. LimeWire appeared. Morpheus. eDonkey. New names, different interfaces, but the familiar feeling remained. Type in a song title, click download, wait, and listen. But there was one crucial difference. These platforms had learned a costly lesson from Napster. No center. No single head to cut off. No headquarters. No visible CEO. No single server that could be ordered shut down. Distributed, flexible, quiet networks. Shut down one node, the data simply flowed around 10 others. Sue, one company, and 3 more emerged somewhere else. The industry began to realize it was no longer fighting an opponent. It was fighting a behavior. And behavior has no address, no lawyers, no boardroom. Then BitTorrent arrived. Not a company, not a service, just a protocol. A method of breaking data into hundreds of pieces, pulled simultaneously from hundreds of different people. The more people shared, the faster it became. The harder it was blocked, the stronger the network grew. By the mid-2000s, BitTorrent accounted for a staggering share of global internet traffic. Not just music, movies, software, data. The way humans exchange information had changed forever. In the music industry's boardrooms, the feeling of victory slowly faded. In its place came a cold realization. They had won a very specific, very precise battle. But they had triggered a chain reaction they could no longer control. Killing Napster didn't extinguish the fire. It taught the fire how to spread faster, And once the first head had fallen, the entire system learned a simple rule. To exist, become invisible. To survive, never concentrate power in one place. The Hydra had awakened. And this time, there was no sword long enough to cut off all the remaining heads. After Napster, after Kazaa, after LimeWire, after BitTorrent, the music industry was finally forced to confront a truth it had avoided for years. The problem was no longer the software, not the websites, not the protocols. The problem was people. A generation had grown up with a new experience. They were used to typing in a song's name and hearing it instantly. They were used to choosing the songs they liked, instead of buying an entire album for a single track. They were used to convenience. And once habits are formed, no law can force people back to the starting point. The music industry didn't lose its audience. It lost the power to decide how that audience consumed music, a quiet but fatal loss. By 2003, when the industry finally accepted legal digital distribution, the initiative was no longer in its hands. iTunes appeared not as a revolution, but as a late compromise. 99 cents per song. No albums. No coercion. Listeners chose. Listeners paid on their own terms. Record labels agreed not because they liked it, but because they had no other choice. Pricing power, the very thing that once allowed them to control the entire market, was now placed in the hands of a technology platform. And once it was let go, it was never regained. Napster never made money from music, but it shaped how music would be monetized afterward, a bitter paradox the industry only understood when it was already too late. Revenue didn't disappear because people stopped loving music. It disappeared because the way people love music had changed. And that change didn't come from business strategy, but from the everyday experiences of millions of people in small rooms, in front of personal computers. The industry once believed that controlling distribution meant controlling behavior. Napster proved the opposite. When technology gives people choice, behavior changes before the system can adapt. And once behavior is changed, every legal battle becomes nothing more than an attempt to prolong an order that has already expired. The story of Napster did not end with a verdict. It ended with a truth that many systems of power refused to face. The music industry believed it was protecting artists. They believed that controlling distribution meant controlling behavior. They believed that if they could kill a company, they could kill the idea behind it. That belief was the trust fault. A flawed assumption, repeated for so long that it began to feel like truth. Shawn Fanning was not a destroyer. He carried no ambition to overthrow anything. He was simply an ordinary person, tired of inconvenience and patient enough to fix it. He didn't create greed. He merely exposed a reality that millions of people had already felt in silence. You can bankrupt a company. You can shut down a brand. You can win every lawsuit, every hearing, every legal battle. But you cannot make people forget an experience that made their lives better. Napster died when Shawn was only 20 years old. But what Napster taught, the world never disappeared. It taught that technology will always follow human behavior, not wait for permission from systems. It taught that when an idea fits the way people actually live, it will find a way to survive no matter how many barriers stand in its path. The music industry did not lose to hackers. It lost because it believed people would forever accept rules that no longer fit their lives. It lost because it believed power could freeze change. But ideas cannot be handcuffed. And human behavior cannot be put on trial. Napster is gone. But the world it opened is still running every day, in every click, every connection, every moment people choose convenience over coercion. That is the trust fault. Not a flaw in technology, but a flaw in how systems place faith in their own power. And the final question still remains. If an 18-year-old could accidentally shake an entire empire, what happens when the next ideas are created deliberately? This story is not over. It has only changed its form,